What if the holiest cities on your ancient map are just, well, in the wrong place?
Yeah.
And, a word you've always thought meant this profound, like, spiritual struggle was actually the name of a brutal, very real ancient slave port.
It completely shatters the way we read history, doesn't it? I mean, we tend to look at the ancient Near East as this static museum exhibit.
Right, exactly, like it's set in stone.
Yeah, we just assume the lines drawn by later empires and the locations codified by medieval theologians are just unquestionable bedrock facts.
We really do. We look at those maps in the back of, historical texts or scriptures, and we just take them for granted. But today we are going to dive into research that suggests those maps may not just be slightly inaccurate. They might be entirely upside down.
Which is a huge claim.
It's massive. And the implications of that geographical shift reveal a massive, ancient, and highly organized system of human exploitation.
Yeah, it could start pretty quickly.
It does. We are exploring the work of Dr. Khaled Waleed today. He has put forward this truly radical reinterpretation of ancient history, geography, theology.
And economics, really.
Yes, pulling deeply from Quranic linguistics, ancient trade records, biblical texts. It's an incredible deep dive into the source material.
It is an incredibly dense and layered body of work. And I think we need to establish our ground rules right at the top here.
Please do. It's important.
Because Dr. Waleed's texts dissect some of the most highly politically and religiously charged historical topics in existence.
Right.
Specifically regarding the history of Bani Israel, the indigenous Canaanites, and, the systemic roots of ancient exploitation.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
So, to our listener, our goal today is strictly to unpack and analyze the source material provided by Dr. Khaled Waleed. We are not endorsing, taking sides, or validating these viewpoints politically.
Exactly. Just reporting what's there.
Right. We are simply acting as your guides to convey the fascinating and honestly complex ideas contained in these specific texts.
Absolutely. We are here to look at the architecture of his argument, and it is a massive structure to walk through.
Where do we even start?
Well, we're going to start by looking at why Dr. Waleed argues we need to literally redraw the map of the ancient Middle East.
The geography shift.
Right. From there, we'll see how that new geography exposes a literal physical machine of human trafficking.
Yeah.
We'll look at the ideological software, the actual rewritten scriptures used to justify that machine, and we'll unpack the incredibly sophisticated, multi-layered system of subjugation that grew out of it.
The 7 tools.
Exactly. Finally, we'll look at how Dr. Waleed reframes the great historical prophets, not just as spiritual teachers, but as, systemic liberators trying to dismantle that very machine.
It's a really compelling through line. Dr. Waleed is essentially arguing that you cannot separate the spiritual messages of these ancient texts from the hardcore macroeconomic realities of the time.
You just can't. Yeah. So let's get right into the geography, because this is the foundation of his entire thesis.
Okay, let's do it.
Dr. Waleed drops this premise early on, right? Our traditional geographic locations for the most pivotal religious events are fundamentally misaligned with the ancient texts.
Yeah, he doesn't pull any punches there.
He starts by looking at the concept of the Blessed Land, which in Quranic terminology is referred to as Baka.
Right.
Now, conventionally, Baka is almost always treated as another name for Makkah in the Arabian Peninsula, but Waleed completely severs that connection.
He does. He uses a very strict, close reading of both Quranic linguistics and ancient topography to argue that Baka is actually Jerusalem.
Wow, okay.
Specifically, the elevated sanctuary area of Al-Aqsa. In his framework, Jerusalem is the true, undisputed original center of monotheism.
So it's the cradle of the prophets.
Exactly. And he builds this argument on the idea of, divine consistency.
I found that argument fascinating. He essentially poses a logical question to the text, right?
Yeah, he says, if the divine voice in these scriptures is swearing by a singular, universally sacred site,
why would it be a location that historically was drowning in paganism and competing shrines?
Right. If you look at the historical and archaeological record of the broader ancient Near East and the Arabian Peninsula, it wasn't a centralized monotheistic haven.
Not at all.
The source material notes there were anywhere from 11 to over 24 different Kaabas, which simply means cubic structures or shrines scattered across the region.
24? I had no idea there were that many.
Yeah, they were used by various tribes for polytheistic worship, housing, hundreds of idols.
So it was just a chaotic religious marketplace?
Exactly. And Dr. Waleed argues it is theologically inconsistent for the singular, universally revered sanctuary the spiritual focal point for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, to be located amidst that specific polytheistic chaos.
That makes a lot of logical sense.
He argues the true sanctuary, the blessed land, has always been Jerusalem.
So if Baka is Jerusalem, what happens to Makkah? Because this is where the geography gets really jarring.
It really does.
Dr. Waleed argues that the historical Makkah, the one described in ancient texts as a hostile environment for early monotheists, was actually located much further north than we think.
Oh, way further north.
He places it in Petra, down in the Wadi Araba, which is that massive barren valley stretching south of the Dead Sea.
Yeah.
He refers to this location, based on a textual description, as the Mutafika, or the overturned cursed city.
The topographical evidence he pulls for this is very specific, too.
How so?
Well, the texts frequently describe the environment of early monotheistic struggle as a valley without cultivation.
Right.
The traditional Makkah in the Hijaz region, while arid, doesn't quite match the profound absolute barrenness historically associated with the deep Wadi Araba near Petra.
I see. So it's a literal geographical mismatch.
Yeah. By relocating this primary site of polytheistic and economic tension to Petra, Waleed completely shifts the narrative of ancient prophetic migrations.
Let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this for the listener. If I'm looking at the map, he's saying the great prophetic journeys weren't these isolated movements in the deep Arabian desert.
No, not at all.
He's arguing they were migrations from this incredibly powerful, polytheistic, and heavily commercial trading hub of Petra the Mutafika up toward the established blessed sanctuary of Jerusalem, or Baka.
That's the route, exactly.
But, like, why does shifting a city a few hundred miles north matter so much? I mean, functionally, does it really change the story?
Well, it changes everything about the socioeconomic context of the story.
Really? How?
Think about it. If you keep the narrative isolated in the deep desert, it reads strictly as a local, tribal, spiritual conflict.
Right, just a theological disagreement among nomads.
Exactly. But when you move the map to center around Petra, the Wadi Araba, and the Levant, you are suddenly placing these religious texts directly on top of those critical, high-stakes international trade routes of the ancient world.
Oh, wow.
You are dealing with empires, massive wealth, and the flow of global commodities.
And one very specific commodity, which is, honestly, the darkest part of this economic reality.
Yeah, it is.
Because when you map this region accurately, placing the center of gravity near Petra, you realize it sits right next to a massive natural geographical choke point.
The Gulf of Aqaba.
The Gulf of Aqaba, exactly. And this is where Dr. Waleed's geographical theory transforms into a devastating socioeconomic critique.
Because Aqaba isn't just a body of water or like a modern tourist destination.
Right.
In the ancient world, it was the gateway.
He focuses heavily on a specific chapter in the Quran, Surah al-Balad, which translates to the city. This chapter contains verses that have intrigued and puzzled scholars for centuries. It talks extensively about the necessity of overcoming the Aqaba.
Yes.
Now, in almost every translation you read, Aqaba is rendered as a metaphor. It's translated as the steep path or the difficult hurdle.
It's interpreted as a spiritual injunction, right? Like, overcome your own ego, climb the steep path of righteousness, fight your inner demons.
Exactly. It's the classic internalization of Scripture. We assume the text is speaking purely to our internal spiritual state.
But Dr. Waleed argues that this is fundamentally a mistranslation, or at least a severe decontextualization.
Yeah.
He argues Aqaba is not a metaphor. It is a literal physical place on the map.
The port city.
Yes. Historically, at the very northern tip of the Red Sea, you have this port. In biblical times, it was known as Ezion Geber.
Okay.
The historical texts indicate this port had been incredibly active since the time of King Solomon. It was the maritime bottleneck that connected the sea routes coming from Africa and Asia to the overland caravan routes managed by the powers in Petra and the Levant.
So it's a massive hub.
Huge. And Dr. Waleed points out that while they traded spices and gold, this port was fundamentally a massive international hub for the slave trade.
This just blew my mind when I read it. He is arguing that the scripture is pointing to a specific physical location where human trafficking was centralized, and his proof is in the very next verse of that chapter.
Right, because the Quranic text doesn't leave Aqaba as an ambiguous concept. It immediately defines it.
It does.
The verse asks, "And what can make you know what the Aqaba is?" And the very next line provides the answer. It is the freeing of a neck.
Wow.
Which is the classical Arabic idiom for the emancipation of a slave.
I just love this part of the analysis because it grounds the text in undeniable physical reality.
It really does.
It's as if you were reading a modern futuristic manifesto and it said, you must overcome Wall Street.
Right.
And then the very next sentence says, and what is Wall Street? It is the canceling of predatory student debt.
That's a great analogy.
You wouldn't read that and think, Wall Street must be a metaphor for my internal feelings of greed.
No, of course not.
You'd recognize it as a physical location that acts as the command center for a specific economic system you are being told to dismantle.
That analogy captures Waleed's point perfectly. By identifying Aqaba as the literal slaves port of Ezion-Geber, the divine command in Surah al-Balad shifts from a generic plea to be a good person into a highly targeted socioeconomic strike.
It's an actionable command.
Exactly. The text is demanding action against a tangible geopolitical entity. To overcome Aqaba meant to physically, economically, and legally confront the system of human trafficking at its geographic source.
It meant going to the port and buying people their freedom, breaking the supply chain.
Breaking the machine itself.
It paints such a vivid picture. You have this maritime bottleneck where fleets of ships are bringing in captive humans from across the known world, offloading them into the Wadi Araba region.
Where merchants from Petra and beyond are purchasing them to work in agriculture or construction or to trade further north.
Right. But this raises a massive psychological question for me. A port like that doesn't just spring up overnight.
No, it takes generations.
It requires infrastructure, capital, and most importantly, it requires a society that is perfectly comfortable with the concept of owning another human being.
That is the crucial pivot right there.
Yeah.
You could build the physical hardware, the docks, the ships, the holding pens at Aqaba, but the machine won't run without the ideological software.
The software, yeah.
You have to program the minds of the merchants, the guards, and the society at large to accept that what they are doing is not an abomination, but perhaps even a natural or divinely ordained right.
And this is where Dr. Waleed's research gets incredibly uncomfortable, because he dives directly into the ancient scriptures to find out who wrote that ideological software and how it functioned.
He really goes there.
He argues that this massive system of exploitation was justified by the intentional alteration of religious texts by a corrupt faction within Bani Israel, the ancient Israelites.
He focuses intensely on specific legal codes within the Old Testament to demonstrate this.
Yeah.
If you look at Leviticus chapter 25, specifically verses 44 through 46, you see the codification of a dual-tiered system of humanity.
Walk us through what that text actually says, because the distinction it makes is just chilling.
Well, within Leviticus 25, there are rules regarding how Israelites are to treat other Israelites who fall into severe debt.
Okay.
The text establishes that an Israelite cannot permanently enslave a fellow Israelite. If a brother becomes poor and sells himself to you, he is to be treated as a hired worker.
So like an employee, essentially.
Kind of. He serves for a set period, usually up to the Jubilee year, or a maximum of 6 years, as noted in other texts like Exodus, and then he must be released. It's essentially a system of indentured servitude designed to eventually clear a debt.
Okay, so there is ceiling on the exploitation if you are part of the in-group.
Exactly. But Dr. Waleed points out the glaring, devastating exception built into verses 44 through 46.
What's the exception?
The text explicitly permits the acquisition of permanent chattel slaves from the nations that are around you.
Wow.
It states that you may buy male and female slaves from these foreign nations and from the temporary residents living among you. And crucially, it says you may bequeath them to your children as inherited property forever.
Inherited property forever.
Yeah. You can work them ruthlessly.
So Dr. Waleed is arguing that this specific carve out the permission to own a foreigner forever as property was not the original divine message.
Right.
He asserts it was an intentional scribal alteration, like a theological loophole created by a corrupt, wealthy faction to justify their economic reliance on the human trafficking flowing through places like Aqaba.
That is his exact argument. By injecting this clause into the sacred text, they gave the slave trade a veneer of religious legitimacy.
Which makes it so much harder to fight.
They made it religiously permissible to treat the other as an exploitable commodity. And Dr. Waleed notes that this other was not just a random assortment of distant peoples. He focuses specifically on the ideological campaign against the indigenous people of the Levant, the Canaanites.
Right. The Canaanites are the primary target in these texts. And to justify subjugating them, you see the deployment of this terrifying theological concept called harem.
Yes, harem is found throughout texts like Deuteronomy 20. It translates roughly to the ban or devotion to God for destruction.
Devotion for destruction.
It was a divine mandate for complete and total annihilation. The text explicitly commanded that when approaching the cities of the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, and others, the armies were to save alive nothing that breathes.
I mean, that is a literal mandate for genocide.
It is, but Dr. Waleed points out a very telling historical shift here. Total annihilation is economically inefficient.
How so?
Because if you wipe out an entire population, sure, you gain their land, but you lose a massive potential labor force.
Oh, I see.
So as the Israelites settled the land, the policy of harem began to shift. Instead of complete extermination, it evolved into permanent enslavement.
He uses the story of the Gibeonites in the book of Joshua, chapter 9, to illustrate this, right?
Precisely. The Gibeonites were a group of Canaanites who, terrified of the approaching armies, used deception to trick the Israelite leadership into a peace treaty.
Okay.
When the deception was discovered, the Israelites couldn't break the sworn treaty by killing them, so they applied the economic alternative.
Which was?
Joshua curses them to become forced laborers forever, specifically, hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of God.
For the altar of God. That phrasing is so important. They framed the forced labor of an entire ethnic group as a service to the divine sanctuary.
It's a complete co-opting of religion.
But I have to push back on something here, or at least point out the deep cognitive dissonance that Dr. Waleed highlights.
Oh, for it.
We talk about the Canaanites as the other, as these foreign enemies that needed to be wiped out or enslaved. But historically, genetically, who were the Canaanites?
They weren't aliens. The Canaanites were descendants of Noah, specifically through his son Ham. They were part of the ancient post-flood patriarchal family tree.
Their family.
Furthermore, remember the story of Abraham. When Abraham migrated from Mesopotamia, where did he go? He went to the land of Canaan. He lived among them.
Right.
He traded with them. He bought the cave of Machpelah from Ephron the Hittite, who was a Canaanite, to bury his wife Sarah. The Canaanites were the indigenous hosts of the early prophets.
So they are enslaving people who are essentially their distant cousins, people who share the exact same broad patriarchal lineage.
Exactly.
How do you square that? How does a society look at people whose ancestors broke bread with Abraham and decide, yes, God says we can own you and your children forever?
Dr. Waleed argues that you can only achieve that level of moral detachment if your society has already normalized exploitation on a smaller scale.
That makes sense.
And this is the critical pivot in his entire analysis. He argues that the brutal exploitation at the port of Aqaba and the subjugation of the Canaanites did not spring out of nowhere. The software of subjugation was first developed, tested, and perfected internally.
Internally.
It began with the exploitation of their own brothers.
So the incubator of tyranny was domestic.
Exactly. He points to the Quranic critique found in Surah al-Baqarah, specifically verses 83 through 85.
What did those verses say?
These verses recount a covenant made with Bani Israel. The covenant was explicit. Do not shed the blood of your own people, and do not evict each other from your homes. It was a divine mandate for internal social cohesion.
But the very next verse condemns them for violating that exact covenant, right?
Yes, it does.
It describes factions within Bani Israel killing their own people, driving a vulnerable segment of their own population out of their homes, and backing each other up in sin and aggression.
And here is where Dr. Waleed highlights the ultimate sickening hypocrisy of the system.
It's so bad.
The text points out that after these corrupt factions had economically ruined their own brothers, displaced them, and essentially left them vulnerable to being captured by foreign powers.
Right.
If those same displaced brothers came back to them as prisoners of war or slaves, the wealthy factions would pay to ransom them.
It's unbelievable. It's an ancient protection racket masquerading as piety.
Yes. You use predatory tactics to bankrupt your neighbor. You force him off his land, which you then acquire. You watch him get dragged away in chains.
And then later, you show up at the slave market, buy his freedom, and pat yourself on the back for fulfilling the religious obligation of redeeming a captive.
All while ignoring the fact that your aggression caused his captivity in the first place.
It is the perfect encapsulation of systemic corruption. And Dr. Waleed argues that once a society is comfortable executing that level of predatory behavior against its own kin, scaling it up to enslave foreign populations like the Canaanites, or running international trafficking hubs like Aqaba, is just a matter of logistics.
Which brings us to the most detailed and, frankly, the most terrifying part of Dr. Waleed's research.
That's 7 tools.
Right, he doesn't just leave it at, they were corrupt and enslaved people. He dissects the exact mechanics of this corruption. Through his textual analysis, he identifies a comprehensive 7-part blueprint for human subjugation. He calls this the ultimate manifestation of taghut, a Quranic term that generally means systemic, overarching tyranny or an idolized system of oppression.
And as we walk through these 7 tools, I want you, the listener, to notice how incredibly relevant they feel, because this isn't just about ancient chains. It's about the architecture of control.
I agree. It is a masterclass in how to completely dismantle a society's independence from the inside out.
Let's look at the first mechanism, which Dr. Waleed places right at the foundation, financial enslavement, and specifically the ancient practice of usury or riba.
Right.
Now, when we hear usury today, we think of like a slightly high APR on a credit card. We don't equate it with literal slavery.
That's because modern finance has sanitized the term. In the ancient Near Eastern world, riba was not a simple fee for borrowing money. It was a mathematical weapon designed to guarantee default.
Explain that. How did it work?
Imagine an agrarian society. A small farmer has a bad harvest. You need seed grain to plant to the next year, or you need silver to pay a local tax. He goes to the wealthy, corrupt faction, the ones altering the text to their advantage. They lend in the seed, but at exorbitant compounding interest rates.
And agricultural yields are unpredictable. If there's a drought, he can't pay the principal, let alone the compounding interest.
Precisely. The debt balloons instantly. So what happens next? First, he forfeits his collateral, which is his land. He becomes a tenant farmer on the land his family owned for generations.
Which is already tragic.
But it gets worse. When he still can't meet the debt obligations, the ancient legal codes allowed the creditor to take the debtor's children as debt slaves.
Oh my God.
And finally, when there's nothing left, the farmer himself is absorbed into the slave class. This is why Dr. Waleed puts riba as the foundational tool.
The financial contract creates the physical slave.
It is the invisible snare of the taghut. It looks voluntary on paper, but structurally, it's a one-way street to subjugation.
It is insidious. You don't need an invading army to conquer a population if you can just lend them into submission. And that leads directly to the second mechanism Waleed identifies: the control of food and resources. The Quranic texts talk about this corrupt faction demanding to exchange the good for the base. What does that mean in an economic context?
It's about engineering dependency. Dr. Waleed points to the narrative of the wilderness wandering. The divine provision was manna and quails, described as good or pure sustenance that required no backbreaking labor.
Right, which allowed the people time for spiritual and social development.
But the text notes that the people rejected this. They demanded the base foods of the earth, garlic, onions, lentils, crops, that in the context of the time required brutal, intense, constant agricultural labor.
Crops that tied them back to the dirt.
Exactly, often tying them back to the very systems of servitude they had escaped in Egypt.
So the tool here is shifting a population from a state of self-sufficiency or divine reliance into a state where their entire existence is consumed by the labor required just to eat the lowest quality food.
Exactly. If you want to control a population, you monopolize their sustenance. You enclose the land, you dictate what is grown, and you ensure that the masses must expend all their energy just to survive.
Wow.
You don't need a whip if you own the only granary in the region. Hunger does the work of the overseer.
And if financial traps and food monopolies aren't enough, we move to the third tool, which is purely brute force: scarcity and social destruction.
Yeah, this one is rough.
Waleed highlights texts that explicitly condemn killing offspring and displacing people from their homes.
This is the physical fracturing of community cohesion. A united, settled community with deep roots in their land is very difficult to exploit.
Because they have a support system.
Exactly. So the architects of the taghut system orchestrate chaos. By creating unbearable economic conditions or inciting localized violence, you force people to flee. You displace them. And what is a displaced person?
They're desperate. They are refugees.
And desperate people are cheap, easily exploitable labor. They have no social safety net, no ancestral land to fall back on.
They'll take whatever deal they can get.
They are forced to accept whatever miserable terms the wealthy merchant class offers them. Furthermore, the killing of offspring, whether that is literal violence or metaphorical, by destroying the economic future and education of the next generation, ensures that the cycle of poverty and subjugation is permanent.
You kill the future to secure your power in the present.
It's a scorched earth policy for human capital.
But to maintain a system this brutal, you can't just rely on force and starvation. People will eventually revolt. You have to convince them that their suffering is somehow justified.
And that brings us to the fourth tool, which is perhaps the most dangerous: the control of knowledge. Specifically, hiding the truth and rewriting Scripture.
Information asymmetry is the ultimate power.
It is. We discussed Leviticus earlier. If the original pristine divine message teaches that all humans hold inherent dignity, that is deeply subversive to a slave-trading economy based in Aqaba.
It threatens the bottom line.
So the elite class utilizes the scribes. They monopolize literacy. They take the sacred texts and they literally edit them. They insert clauses that say, God permits you to own the foreigner.
By doing that, they weaponize faith against the faithful?
Yes. They make the oppressed believe their oppression is ordained by the universe. And they make the oppressor believe his cruelty is the form of religious devotion. When you control the text, you control reality.
Which bleeds perfectly into the fifth tool, legislative control. Waleed points to a fascinating Quranic critique that says, people took their rabbis and their monks to be their lords besides Allah. I always read that as a critique of people practically worshiping their religious leaders, like treating them as divine.
It's more administrative than that, actually.
Really?
Yeah, Dr. Waleed explains that taking them as lords meant blindly accepting their legislative authority over what was legal and illegal, even when it directly contradicted the core divine principles of justice.
Ah, I see.
If the religious elite, working in tandem with the wealthy merchants, decree that a complex new form of usury is suddenly permissible through a clever legal loophole.
Like a technicality that makes it not technically riba.
Exactly. Or if they decree that a specific war of expansion is holy, the masses obey without questioning the underlying morality.
So it's just a rubber stamp.
The legislative tool gives a polished, professional veneer of legal and religious righteousness to outright theft and slavery. The scribes rewrite the law, and the scholars rubber stamp it.
It's an ancient lobbyist system. But how do the individuals executing the system, the guards, the debt collectors, the slave traders, sleep at night?
That requires the sixth tool, psychological control, specifically the cultivation of a chosen people's superiority complex.
Right. To commit systemic atrocities, you must first dehumanize your victim and elevate yourself.
Exactly. The psychological tool is the instilled belief that your specific group is inherently superior, divinely favored above all others. Therefore, the rules of basic empathy, justice, and human rights do not apply when you are dealing with the unlettered, the Gentiles, or the outsiders.
It creates a moral firewall.
It does. It allows a merchant to stand on the docks of Aqaba, look at a chained Canaanite or African human being, and feel absolutely no guilt.
Because they don't even see them as human.
Right. His ideological software tells him that this person is fundamentally lesser, a different category of being entirely. The superiority complex is the anesthetic that allows a society to perform the surgery of exploitation without feeling the pain of conscience.
And the final mechanism, tool number 7, social division, turning brothers against each other.
The classic tactic of empires. Divide and conquer. We saw this in the text concerning Bani Israel evicting their own people.
Yeah.
As long as the lower and middle classes of a society are fractured into competing factions fighting over scraps, religious technicalities, or minor tribal differences, they cannot unite to identify and dismantle the actual systems of oppression.
They're too busy fighting each other.
The Takhut thrives on internal division. The elites fund both sides, watch them exhaust their energy on infighting, and profit from the resulting chaos.
When you lay all 7 of those tools out, financial usury, resource monopoly, forced displacement, rewritten texts, corrupt legislation, racial superiority, and engineered division, it is staggering.
It really is an airtight matrix of control.
If you have those 7 mechanisms running simultaneously, the population practically polices itself. The chains become invisible.
Dr. Waleed's synthesis here is profound. He is demonstrating that true slavery is not limited to the iron shackles found at the port of Aqaba. The shackles are just the final physical manifestation of the system.
So the system itself is the slavery.
True slavery is the Takhut itself.
Mm-hmm.
It's the reality where you don't own the land you farm. Your money is created out of compounding debt. Your history has been rewritten by the victors. Your laws are drafted by the elites. And your religious leaders assure you that this is exactly how God wants it to be.
So if humanity is trapped inside this invincible, multi-layered machine, how is there any hope? How did anyone ever fight back?
According to Dr. Waleed, this is precisely where we misunderstand the role of the prophets.
This part is just an incredible reframing of history. We are so accustomed to viewing the major prophets, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, as these gentle, primarily spiritual teachers.
Right.
Figures who came down to teach people how to pray correctly, how to be kind to their neighbors, how to perform rituals to ensure a good afterlife.
The sanitized Sunday school narrative, it removes their historical teeth.
Exactly. But Dr. Waleed strips away that sanitization. He reframes these figures as radical, systemic liberators.
He views them as ancient abolitionists who intentionally targeted specific pillars of this 7-part enslavement system.
Let's look at how he analyzes Moses through this lens. Moses is arguably the most famous liberator in history, but Waleed looks at what specifically Moses was fighting.
Moses is taking on Pharaoh. But Pharaoh, in this context, isn't just an arrogant king. He is the ultimate embodiment of political and physical enslavement.
He declares himself a god, essentially.
Pharaoh literally declares, "I am your Lord, the Most High." He has instituted the ultimate takhet. He utilizes the tool of manufactured scarcity and social destruction perfectly.
By targeting the children.
Exactly. He orders the killing of the male offspring of the Israelites while keeping the women alive for servitude, ensuring the demographic and psychological destruction of the community.
He's executing the blueprint perfectly.
He is. And Moses' response is not just to preach a new theology to Pharaoh. Moses directly attacks the economic engine of Egypt.
How does he do that?
He organizes a massive labor strike. He leads the entire enslaved workforce out of the country, collapsing the agricultural and construction economy of the empire.
That is a direct economic strike.
But Dr. Waleed points out something even more critical. After the liberation, Moses spends the rest of his life in the desert, desperately trying to deprogram his own people.
Deprogram them from what?
He is warning the newly freed Israelites not to adopt the very same 7-part enslavement practices of the Pharaoh they just escaped.
He's trying to prevent them from becoming the next oppressors, which, as we discussed with the exploitation of the Canaanites and their own brothers, tragically failed in many respects.
Yes.
So if Moses attacked the political and physical subjugation, how does Dr. Waleed view the mission of Jesus?
Jesus targets the first tool of the system, financial enslavement. Dr. Waleed points to the most aggressive, physically confrontational act Jesus commits in all of the gospel narratives.
It's not a sermon.
It's when he walks into the temple in Jerusalem, makes a whip, and violently overturns the tables of the money changers.
The cleansing of the temple. He shouts, "You have made my father's house a den of thieves." But why the money changers, specifically? Why not the Roman guards?
Because the Roman guards were just the muscle. The money changers were the engine. By this period in history, the temple had been co-opted.
Co-opted by who?
It was no longer just Baka, the blessed sanctuary. It had become the central bank of the region. The corrupt religious elite, the scribes and Pharisees that Jesus constantly critiques, had merged religious obligation with the riba system.
Oh, wow.
They required temple taxes and offerings to be paid in specific Tyrian coinage, forcing the poor to use the temple money changers who charged extortionate exchange rates.
They were trapping the poorest, most vulnerable people in financial debt under the strict guise of religious purity.
Exactly. They were using Tool 5 legislative control by religious lords to enforce Tool 1 financial usury.
That's brilliant.
Jesus' physical strike against those tables wasn't just a fit of pique. It was a highly symbolic and literal assault on the economic engine of the Ta'akud operating inside the sacred space. He was attacking the bankers who were enslaving the poor.
Which brings us to the final major prophetic figure in this historical lineage, Muhammad. How does Dr. Waleed fit him into this specific war against the 7 tools of enslavement?
According to Waleed's framework, Muhammad is tasked with targeting the ultimate geographic and economic hub of the physical slavery system. He targets the Aqaba.
The literal port of human change.
Yes. If you look at the early revelations and the core structural changes Muhammad implements, he makes the dismantling of slavery a central, inescapable pillar of the faith.
He operationalizes the command of Fak Raqaba, the freeing of a neck.
Right. He doesn't just suggest that freeing a slave is a nice charitable act. He weaves it into the very jurisprudence of the religion. He makes it an act of the highest spiritual worship.
And he ties it to legal penalties, right? This is what I found so brilliant from a purely economic standpoint.
He weaponizes religious guilt against the slave economy. In the legal framework established, if you commit a major sin, the primary mechanism for expiation is the freeing of a slave. If you break a solemn oath, you must free a slave.
Yeah.
If you commit involuntary manslaughter, the penalty involves freeing a slave.
So think about the macroeconomic impact of that. In a society where merchants and tribes are constantly sinning, breaking oaths, or getting into conflicts.
Which humans always do.
Exactly. He essentially creates a massive, constant, religion-wide economic demand for the purchasing and immediate freeing of slaves.
It's an ingenious systemic attack. It's an economic boycott and a liberation movement disguised as a religious penalty system.
Because it messes with the supply and demand.
He is forcefully driving up the cost of slaves by buying them out of the market to free them, directly attacking the profit margins of the supply chain flowing through the Aqaba port and the Petra trade routes.
That is just incredible.
Dr. Waleed argues that if you step back and look at this entire timeline, you don't just see a series of disconnected religious movements. You see one continuous, brutal war spanning millennia.
The eternal war.
Yes. On one side, you have the system of exploitation. Dr. Waleed traces its ideological roots to the ancient concept of Iblis, which represents ultimate arrogance, the belief that one is inherently superior to another and therefore has the right to subjugate them.
And that arrogance manifests in the political tyranny of Pharaoh.
Right, and the hoarding of vast wealth and monopolies by figures like Korah or Qarun in the Arabic texts, and the corrupt scribes rewriting texts.
And on the other side?
On the other side, you have the prophetic mission, a continuous lineage of liberators sent to break the financial, physical, and psychological chains of the Taghut.
It is such a radically different way to read these ancient texts. Instead of a manual for personal piety, it reads like a manifesto for human emancipation.
It really changes everything.
But as compelling as this historical reframing is, we have to look at the reality of the world that followed. Because the depressing truth is, systemic exploitation did not end with the prophets.
No, it certainly didn't.
Slavery continued for centuries. The financial traps continued. So how does Dr. Waleed bring this timeline forward? Does the Aqaba system survive?
It doesn't just survive, it adapts.
Yeah.
And this brings us to Dr. Waleed's analysis of the Middle Ages and how these 7 tools evolved.
Okay, let's get into that.
He looks closely at the Abbasid era, roughly the 8th to 10th centuries, and he highlights the activities of a specific network of merchants known as the Radhanites.
Who were the Radhanites?
They were a highly influential network of early medieval merchants. We know a significant amount about them from historical records, particularly the writings of the 9th century Persian geographer and bureaucrat Ibn Khordadbeh.
What did he document about them?
He documented their trade routes, which were incredibly vast. These merchants managed logistics that stretched from the Frankish kingdoms in Western Europe, across the Mediterranean, down through the Red Sea, right through our old geographic choke points of Aqaba, and all the way to India and China.
And what were these vast networks moving?
They moved luxury goods, silk, spices, furs, swords. But the historical records confirm they were also heavily involved in the logistics of the global slave trade.
Right.
They moved European captives, Slavic slaves from the north, and African slaves, utilizing the very maritime and overland routes that had been established centuries earlier.
Now, this is a moment where we need to tread very carefully and be incredibly precise with Dr. Waleed's analysis because he addresses a very specific modern controversy here.
We do need to be precise, yes.
When discussing these medieval merchants, he brings up a highly controversial book published in 1991 by the Nation of Islam titled The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews.
Right.
This book made sweeping, highly racialized claims asserting the absolute dominance and orchestration of the global slave trade by Jewish people.
Yes, and we must unpack Dr. Waleed's exact nuance on this, because he threads a very careful needle. Dr. Waleed agrees with the baseline historical documentation, like that of Ibn Khordadbeh, that certain merchant networks, like the Radhanites, many of whom were of Jewish descent, were indeed active participants in the international slave trade and the practice of usury during the Middle Ages.
So he acknowledges the history.
The records confirmed their participation as a historical fact.
Right. They were undeniably part of the mercantile machinery.
However, and this is a massive and foundational however, Dr. Waleed fundamentally and explicitly rejects the Nation of Islam's overarching racial generalization.
Why does he reject it? On what grounds?
He rejects it on 2 fronts, theological and historical. Theologically, it violates the absolute core of his Quranic analysis. Dr. Waleed insists that the Quranic metric of justice judges behavior, never race, ethnicity, or bloodline.
Okay, that makes sense.
The divine texts condemn the actions, the act of riba, the act of altering scripture, the act of enslaving another human. They do not condemn a race of people.
Because to do that would be falling into one of the tools of control.
Exactly. To generalize a behavior to an entire ethnicity is to utilize tool. Number 6, the psychological superiority and division complex, which is exactly what the texts are fighting against.
And what is his historical argument against that generalization?
The historical data itself proves that a claim of singular dominance is false. The Radhanites were successful precisely because they were neutral intermediaries operating within a vast, collaborative, multi-ethnic network of human failure.
So they're just one cog in a very large machine.
Yes. They didn't capture the slaves in Northern Europe. Viking raiders did that. They didn't control the Slavic middle markets. And when they moved captives down through the Red Sea or overland, who was buying them?
Who?
Arab, Persian, and Turkish elites in the Abbasid Caliphate.
So to say one single ethnic group dominated or masterminded the trade is historically illiterate. It ignores the massive demand side of the equation and the complex supply chain involving multiple empires.
Exactly. The Radhanites found an economic niche because they possessed the linguistic skills and the neutral status required to cross the hostile ideological borders between the Christian empires of Europe and the Islamic empires of the Middle East.
Right.
But the system of Taqat, the insatiable demand for free labor, the financial structures of debt that enabled it, was a collaborative human enterprise.
A global effort of exploitation.
Waleed's ultimate point here is that the tools of enslavement, usury, displacement, monopoly are completely agnostic. They're adopted by whoever holds power and is morally compromised enough to use them, regardless of their background.
And that realization is the perfect bridge to his final conclusion, because if the tools are agnostic and they simply adapt to whoever's in power, what does that mean for us today? Has the system of Aqaba finally been dismantled?
Dr. Waleed's chilling conclusion is that the Aqaba system never died. It simply evolved.
It evolved.
The physical chains of the ancient slave ports became obsolete. But they didn't become obsolete because the human desire to exploit miraculously vanished. They became obsolete because the tools of the Taqat became profoundly more sophisticated and efficient.
So, if I'm understanding the trajectory of his argument, the modern architect of this system isn't standing on a wooden dock with a whip in his hand?
No, definitely not.
The modern overseer is wearing a bespoke, tailored suit. They are sitting in the glass boardrooms of central banks, adjusting global interest rates.
Right.
They are using international economic sanctions to starve out entire nations without ever firing a shot.
Absolutely. Yeah. Let's run the diagnostic of the 7 ancient tools against our modern world. Tool 1, financial enslavement. We no longer have local merchants trapping farmers with seed grain.
And what do we have instead?
We have a global system of fiat currency and central banking. We have unpayable compounding national debts where entire developing nations are essentially indentured servants to international monetary funds, forced to gut their own social infrastructure just to pay the interest.
Tool 2, food and resource monopoly. We don't have kings hoarding granaries. We have a handful of multinational conglomerates that hold patents on the actual genetic code of the seeds we plant. They monopolize the global agricultural supply chain.
It's terrifying. And look at tools 4 and 5, knowledge and legislative control.
Yeah.
The ancient scribes altering texts and the monks acting as lords have been replaced by massive media conglomerates that dictate the narrative reality for billions of people.
And the legislative loopholes.
They are no longer written by corrupt rabbis. They are written by armies of corporate lobbyists, offshore accountants, and elite lawyers who legally hide trillions in illicit wealth while the working class bears the tax burden.
The mechanics are identical. The chains are still completely intact. They are just made of paper, digital code, and complex financial instruments now.
You don't need to physically chain someone to a galley ship if you can chain them to a lifetime of unpayable medical or educational debt.
They will row the boat voluntarily just to survive.
Precisely. The tag hut evolved from the iron shackles and physical bottleneck of Azion Gubber to the invisible algorithms, high-frequency trading, and predatory lending of the modern global economy.
So the physical Aqaba was replaced by an invisible, omnipresent one.
Yeah, that's it exactly.
Okay, let's take a breath and look back at the sheer scale of the journey Dr. Waleed has taken us on today. We started by literally redrawing the map of the Holy Land, moving the focal point of ancient monotheism away from the deep desert, and placing it squarely at the geopolitical crossroads of Jerusalem and the economic powerhouse of Petra.
We exposed Aqaba not as a gentle metaphor for spiritual self-improvement, but as a literal, brutal slave port on the Red Sea.
Right. We unpacked the deeply disturbing ideological software that utilized altered scriptures to justify the eternal, permanent enslavement of indigenous people like the Canaanites.
We broke down the mechanics of the Taqat, detailing the 7-part blueprint of systemic subjugation from the foundational trap of usury and manufactured scarcity and the psychological warfare of racial superiority and internal division.
And through that lens, we saw the greatest prophets in human history completely reframed, not just as mystics pointing to the sky, but as radical, on-the-ground liberators fighting a brutal, ancient war against a financial and physical slave trade.
A trade that, as we just discussed, simply put on a suit, updated its technology, and evolved into the modern geopolitical and financial system.
It is a heavy, profound synthesis of geography, textual theology, and macroeconomic history. And I think Dr. Waleed's work leaves us with a final, vital thought to ponder.
He demonstrates that historically, the absolute most effective form of slavery is the one where the enslaved populations don't even realize they're in chains.
You say they can't see them?
They don't know they're captives because their chains aren't made of iron. They are made of normalized student debt, of manufactured scarcity, of targeted algorithmic outrage, and carefully altered information.
So to you listening, as you go about your week, look closely at the systems you interact with. Look at your own bank accounts, the digital contracts you blindly accept, the media you consume, and the narratives you are handed about the other.
What invisible Aqaba is operating in the background of your life right now?
And more importantly, what will it take for you to overcome it? It's a powerful, unsettling question. And maybe finding the answer starts with simply looking at the map of reality you've been handed and having the courage to ask if someone, somewhere, drew it upside down on purpose. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly dense and fascinating deep dive. Keep questioning the maps, keep questioning the narratives, and we'll see you next time.